Hi, Modern World History students. This is an Edpuzzle lecture on the Paris Peace Conference, or basically the way World War I officially comes to an end. And so we're going to be focusing today on the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. So if you'll remember, last week we talked about the end of World War I, how it comes to an end on the Eastern Front, and then a few months later it comes to an end on the Western Front. But with a global conflict this big, it just because the fighting stops doesn't really mean the problems are solved. And so what the Allied powers decide to do is convene together to hold this Paris Peace Conference. And the reason they need to kind of come up with a plan for peace is because the destruction from World War I was, kind of astronomical. The number of casualties, both with soldiers and civilians, was high. There was a lot of land and territory that had been destroyed, particularly in France. The world has seen this major buildup of weapons, and we even now have lots of soldiers who are coming home with injuries and those sorts of things. And so the toll of the war is incredibly huge, and they have to be able to kind of address this. And this is what they're going to try to do through the Paris Peace Conference. So, in terms of the actual conference, it was convened in January of 1919, and it basically had a whole bunch of delegates and heads of state representing the Allied powers, right? The 27 countries who had kind of won World War I. And oftentimes, when we talk about the Paris Peace Conference, we're going to be talking about the Big Four. It really was the leadership of, the United Kingdom, United States, France, and Italy that sort of determines the direction of this peace conference and the decisions that are made. And it's important to recognize that Russia does not actually attend. And this is because they are kind of locked in a civil war after their revolutions. And we'll talk about Russia later this week. But even though they had been they were part of the Allies, and so in some ways on the winning side, remember, they had pulled themselves out of World War I early. And so they're sort of dealing with their own internal issues and are not in attendance. And it's probably important to note here that Germany is not a part of this peace conference either. So any of the Central Powers are not invited to kind of negotiate how this peace will look. So here's a picture of your Big Four, the leaders that represent these four countries who negotiate the treaty. You have the French Premier, Georges Clemenceau, the Italian Premier, Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. These are going to be the four men who kind of negotiate this treaty. So, in terms of the conference, they have a big question. Is this peace going to be a peace of justice, a peace of fairness, or is it going to be a peace of vengeance, a peace of revenge? The whole time we have President Woodrow Wilson with his 14 points advocating for a peace without victory. Woodrow Wilson was really looking to create global peace. But on the other end are going to be his European counterparts, and they're very much interested in more of a peace of revenge. They want Germany to have to pay for some of the damages that have been caused to their countries, both in terms of casualties and in France in kind of dealing with the destruction of land. And so, as I mentioned, all the Allied nations are invited to Paris except Russia. The Central Powers are excluded. And it's important to kind of remember that the US is sort of in a unique position here at the end of World War I. They're not a European power. They're very industrialized. They're on the winning side, but this really truly is their first time at the adult table, so to speak. But the US is really going to take a leadership role. So, in terms of what they need to decide, they have to think about who is to blame and how much blame to put on specific countries. How are we going to pay for all of these damages? What's going to happen to all of this weaponry and military buildup? What should happen to the colonies and territories that we own? And so the big treaty that we're going to pay attention to is the Treaty of Versailles, but it is important to know that separate peace treaties are negotiated with the other defeated powers. So there's separate treaties that deal with Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And one of the things that I find interesting about the Treaty of Versailles is that the German government basically believes that one of the reasons they end up surrendering, right, and start signing the armistice on November 11th of 1918 is because they believe that Woodrow Wilson's 14 points are going to be included in this peace treaty. This cartoon kind of, shows the steps, the 14 points, the way to peace. They believe that these ideas are going to be incorporated into the peace treaty, and so they believe they will be treated fairly. However, when we look at the Treaty of Versailles and its actual terms, we're going to find that that's not the case. In fact, most of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points are going to be ignored in the final draft of the treaty. The treaty is signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. This is supposed to be sort of humiliating for Germany because the Palace of Versailles is in France, and it's also the same palace where Germany had first declared themselves a country. And so it's a symbolic place where this is signed. But for Germany, it feels like a dictated peace. Germany is going to be forced to sign this treaty. Remember, they're not part of the negotiations at all. And so they're going to be walked in, given the treaty, and basically forced to sign it. And one of the reasons they're forced to sign it is because the Allied powers still had a naval blockade in place around Germany. And what this meant is that Germany was struggling to get food into the country, which means most of their civilians were starving and their military was not in a position to keep fighting the war. And so ultimately, Germany is not in a position where they can negotiate. They are going to be forced to sign this treaty. And this is going to be incredibly embarrassing and humiliating for Germany because the peace terms have a lot of consequences for Germany. The first is that Germany is going to be forced to accept war guilt, called Article 231. They basically have to accept blame for the whole war, and they're going to be forced to pay war reparations or money that equaled civilian damages, large amounts of reparations. We believe it's about $33 billion is about what it comes to. The German army, which had been their kind of pride of their country, is going to be limited to about 100,000 men, more of a police force than an army. And they're not going to be allowed to build up any military fortifications. Their navy is going to be limited, and they're going to not be allowed any submarines or U-boats at all. They're going to lose land. They're going to lose the territory Alsace-Lorraine. That's going to go back to France. The Saar Valley and the Rhineland, two areas of Germany that are kind of industrial areas and would have helped them with their economy, are going to be sort of given to France for a time. The country of Poland is going to be carved out of German territory, so Germany is going to lose some significant land. And they're also going to be forced to give up all of their colonies to the Allied powers. So essentially, what we are looking at is that the Allied powers are not really going to be forced to give up anything in terms of building a future peace. And the terms of the treaty are going to be so severe that it keeps Germany from rebuilding. In fact, Germany like I said, is sort of humiliated and disgusted by this treaty. One of their foreign ministers has kind of these two quotes. He says, "Those who sign this treaty will sign the death sentence of many millions of German men, women, and children." So the first problem is that they believe that this treaty is going to keep them from rebuilding, is going to severely harm their economy. And they also feel that it's just unfair. And he says this fat volume, this treaty, was quite unnecessary. They could have expressed the whole thing more simply in one clause. Germany renounces its existence. Again, they're going to feel very bitter that the terms of this treaty were too harsh. And in fact, in the years following the signing of the peace treaty, lots of little pamphlets or tracts are going to come out that kind of show just how unfair this treaty was. And here on the screen, you're kind of seeing some examples of this. Germany's agricultural production is significantly lowered after the treaty. They're going to lose land. Their navy's reduced. Their ability to produce iron ore, their colonies are gone, their coal production goes down. And so these are all going to be things that sort of anger Germany in the years following the treaty. It's also important to note that the Treaty of Versailles actually recreates the map of Europe. It establishes 9 new nations, and you will analyze this map later in this lesson today. And part of the changes to the map means that Russia loses territory. Remember, they'd fought on the side of the Allies, but they're actually going to lose territory. So countries like Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania all used to be territory of Russia, and now they are independent countries. And the Treaty of Versailles is also going to create a League of Nations. But remember, Wilson's forced to concede almost all of his 14 points to achieve this point 14, this League of Nations. So the League of Nations, just to kind of go over it a little bit here, really was designed to promote international cooperation. And its hope was that countries would learn to settle their disputes through diplomacy, right? Through cooperation and through discussion rather than through war. And so another goal of the League of Nations was to reduce arms or to reduce military weapons. The idea was that all nations would have one vote and that everybody would be included. There would be a specific council of kind of the World War I victors in case of there were any major issues that needed to be decided. And ultimately, diplomacy was going to be used to keep peace. They did decide that economic sanctions or bans on trade, including blockades, could be used on countries who didn't follow through with their obligations. And the League of Nations was also given control of some colonies. They called them mandates until they were ready for self-government and independence. But ultimately, the World Court could really only offer advisory opinions on issues. So we're going to watch a quick video clip here on the League of Nations.
The year was 1920, and World War I was coming to an end. Many countries were sick of fighting and wanted there to be lasting peace worldwide. If all of these countries agreed on the same thing, it might be a good idea to form a group or club, right? This is when the League of Nations was born. The League of Nations included 63 countries from every continent in the world joined together to promote peace. They had a goal of settling disagreements through meetings instead of wars. Their covenant stated their goal was preventing wars through collective security and disarmament and settling international disputes through negotiation and arbitration. The League of Nations also had a goal of improving civil rights around the world, like labor conditions, human trafficking, treatment of native inhabitants, prisoners of war, and global health. The League was a way of checking up on one another and making sure people around the world had a better quality of life. The League of Nations would also mediate talks about territorial disputes. Often countries couldn't agree on where their borders were and what areas of land they owned, especially islands. The League of Nations worked to settle these disputes peacefully. The League of Nations lasted until 1946. At this point, it disbanded, and the United Nations was formed, which still exists today.
So, in terms of the League of Nations, its intent was obviously a really good thing, right? It's going to promote peace and cooperation between the international community. And they had some awesome goals. It mentioned the League of Nations does help with refugees, global health, labor issues, so all kinds of really important issues. But there is kind of a problem with this organization, and the problem really is that the United States rejects the treaty. The US Senate, kind of under the guidance of Henry Cabot Lodge, basically refuses to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, the United States never even signs the Treaty of Versailles. They were concerned that the US was going to get caught up in kind of international conflicts and problems, that the United States wouldn't be able to declare war anymore if they needed to. And President Wilson doesn't really want to compromise, because he feels so strongly about the treaty in the League of Nations. And so ultimately, the U.S. never actually joins the League of Nations. And this is really problematic because the League of Nations really has no enforcement power without the United States. And this is because the United States has established itself as a global leader. It is kind of in a position, both economically after the war, to kind of take on this really important role, and yet they don't join. And, how ironic, right? President Woodrow Wilson creates and comes up with this idea of the League of Nations, and yet his own country never even joins. And ultimately, it's going to leave a very weak League of Nations that is going to struggle to really deal with international conflict. And so what we find is that this Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles really has this lasting legacy that ultimately kind of creates the conditions for World War II. We're going to see that Germany is going to kind of seek revenge for the treaty and what they believe was, kind of wrongful terms put on them. The reparations are going to be so huge that it's going to drastically harm the global economy. You'll remember we've talked about kind of after World War I, the Great Depression and some of the economic issues that existed. Many Germans are going to be resentful, and in fact, even people in Russia and Italy, because they're going to feel like they didn't get treated fairly in this treaty. Hitler is going to use the Treaty of Versailles as kind of a rallying point for the German people. And ultimately, these conditions are going to be impossible to enforce or meet. And we kind of see that with the League of Nations. And of course, this new map of Europe, there's 9 new independent countries. And at this point, they're fairly unstable democracies. Democracy is new for these countries, and they're going to struggle to kind of get themselves up and running after the war. So we'll watch a quick video clip on this legacy as well.
World War I leads to World War II as day follows night. By the end of World War I, everybody is looking to get advantage.
World War I didn't really end in 1918. It brutalized an entire generation of Europeans. It brutalized an entire generation of people around the world. And it made them realize that war on this scale was not only possible, but actually thinkable.
There's a wonderful, wonderful political cartoon where the fat politicians and generals are walking out of Versailles, and there's a little tiny boy, and he's crying in the corner. And I'm not kidding, he says, "I'm cannon fodder for 1940. They knew, anyone with half a brain knew that the Treaty of Versailles was essentially the starting gun for the Second World War.
Essentially what happened is that you create such an unstable economy and so much animosity between nations that you're just seeding the field of war to rise and grow again.
A lot of the anger, animosity, resentment that fuels the rise of the National Socialists of Adolf Hitler in Germany can be directly tied to that. It would be difficult to argue that that's simply propaganda that's utilized by Adolf Hitler. These were very difficult terms for the German people to handle. And it creates this bunker mentality, this us against the world mentality that ultimately will play out in Hitler being able to create a program that appeals to that sentiment.
To the average German, they have been sold out by the politicians.
In particular, it made people like Adolf Hitler, who had fought, after all, in the German army in World War I, think that if only the Germans could do it again, but do it right this time, they could actually win.
We call it World War I, World War II, but it's really two different stages of one global conflict. Just happens that people put their arms down for a 20-year period, and then they went back to fighting again.
So that brings us to the end of our lecture here. And you will have one last task today, and that is completing the Treaty of Versailles map analysis assignment.